The Ouagadougou sun cast a gentle warmth that morning, a stark contrast to the weighty responsibilities usually resting on President Ibrahim Traoré's shoulders. He'd chosen this day for an unannounced visit to a local street kitchen, a deliberate departure from the usual motorcades and formalities. No cameras, no immaculate suits, no phalanx of security guards. Just him, dressed in simple civilian clothes, hoping to feel the city's pulse, to connect with its people unfiltered. The air was rich with the comforting aromas of everyday life. Rice simmering, yams frying, the sharp, inviting scent of pepper soup. Children's laughter echoed nearby, a melodic counterpoint to the rhythmic stirring of large pots by women whose faces were etched with stories. In a quiet corner, an old man coaxed a melancholic tune from a wooden flute, its notes weaving through the market's subtle hum. President Traoré offered a small, genuine smile as he approached the worn wooden counter. The cook, a man whose hands knew the language of hard work, looked up, his eyes widening first in surprise, then in dawning recognition. He quickly recovered, his initial shock morphing into profound honor as he offered a deep, respectful bow. "Mr. President," he stammered, his voice thick with emotion, "please, allow me. Let me serve you the very best we have to offer." A steaming plate was promptly set down, a generous mound of rice, glistening with a savory sauce, accompanied by a piece of perfectly grilled fish. The sight was humble, yet deeply inviting. Traoré reached forward, his fingers anticipating the warmth of the plate, but just as he was about to grasp it, a shout, sharp and urgent, sliced through the market's ambient sounds. "Don't eat that!" The entire scene froze. The laughter died, the stirring ceased. Even the flute's melody seemed to hang, suspended and incomplete. Every head turned towards the source of the cry. A small boy, barefoot and coated in the fine dust of the streets, no older than 10, had darted forward from the periphery. He stood there, chest heaving, his small frame trembling. The spoon in President Traoré's hand halted mid-air, a tableau of interrupted normalcy. "Please," the boy pleaded again, his voice softer this time, but no less intense, his gaze fixed on the plate. "Don't eat it." A heavy silence descended upon the market square. No one moved. It felt as if no one dared to breathe. President Traoré slowly lowered his hand, his expression unreadable for a moment, before it settled into one of gentle concern. He looked directly at the child, his voice calm amidst the sudden tension. "Why?" he asked simply. The boy, overwhelmed, dropped to his knees, the rough ground unforgiving against his bare skin. He whispered, the word barely audible, yet carrying the weight of a terrible secret. "It's poisoned!" A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. The cook's hands began to shake violently, his face draining of color. Guards, instinctively reacting to the perceived threat, started to move forward, their expressions grim. But Traoré raised a hand, a clear, authoritative gesture. "No one touches the boy," he commanded, his tone even but firm. He then did something that stunned the crowd further. He knelt beside the trembling child, bringing himself to eye level. He placed a reassuring hand on the boy's thin shoulder. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice imbued with a gentleness that belied the gravity of the situation. The boy's lips quivered. "Solomane," he managed, his voice a thread. "And how do you know it's poison, Solomane?" Traoré pressed, still gentle, his eyes searching the boy's frightened face. Solomane cast a fearful glance towards the kitchen, towards the now ashen-faced cook. "Because I saw the man," he explained, words tumbling out in a rush. "He came before dawn. He argued with the cook, loud. Then, when no one was watching, he poured something from a little bottle, into the big pot, the one for the sauce." His eyes, wide and haunted, conveyed the terror of what he'd witnessed. "I sleep near the garbage bins over there," he added, pointing a shaky finger. "I heard everything. I saw it." All eyes now swiveled to the cook, who began to bluster, his voice cracking despite his efforts at indignation. "That's not true. He's just a street boy. He's lying, Mr. President. Lying." President Traoré rose slowly, his gaze unwavering. He turned to one of his aides, who had discreetly moved closer. "Get the food tested," he ordered, his voice low but clear. Quietly. "And now?" Within minutes, the plate was carefully covered and taken away in a sealed container. The crowd remained, a silent, watchful sea of faces. Soleimane, still on his knees, looked as if he might collapse, his small body swaying. It was clear he hadn't eaten properly in days. Traoré knelt again. "When did you last eat, son?" he asked, the paternal term slipping out naturally. Soleimane hesitated, his gaze dropping to the dusty ground. 3 days ago, he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. A single tear traced a path down his grimy cheek, a testament to his silent suffering. In a spontaneous gesture of profound empathy, President Traoré gently pulled the boy into his arms, holding him close. The news, as news does, spread like wildfire. By noon, the market was swarming, not with panicked citizens, but with people drawn by whispers of the morning's incredible events. The president hugged a homeless boy. They say the food was actually poisoned. There were no cameras. He wasn't there for a show. And President Traoré stayed. He didn't retreat to the security of his palace. He sat with Soleimane on a rough wooden bench at that small street kitchen, a silent vigil of shared humanity, waiting. He wouldn't leave, not until the results came back. The fate of a nation, the life of its leader, had rested on the desperate cry of its most invisible child. And in that moment, Traoré knew, deep in his bones, that something had to change. He remembered a time, long ago, when he too had been a boy who knew the sharp pangs of hunger, who had gone to bed with an empty stomach and an uncertain future. The memory, rarely surfaced, now returned with a poignant clarity, fueling a resolve that was beginning to take shape within him. The afternoon sun beat down on Ouagadougou as a palpable tension clung to the air around the small street kitchen. Hours had passed since the initial alarm, hours in which President Ibrahim Traoré had remained steadfastly by young Soleimane's side. Finally, a messenger arrived, breathless, carrying a sealed report. The head of security, his face grim, handed it directly to Traoré. The president opened it, his eyes scanning the single page. He read it, closed his eyes for a brief moment, then looked up. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but carried the weight of undeniable truth. The boy's right. A collective sigh, a mixture of horror and relief, swept through the onlookers. Eyes darted towards the kitchen, where the cook, sensing his fate, had vanished into the dim back room. Seconds later, a commotion erupted as he attempted to flee through a rear alley. 2 soldiers, moving with practiced calm, intercepted him. There were no guns raised, no shouts, no overt violence, just the quiet, inexorable hand of justice. Soleimane, who had been clutching Traoré's sleeve, trembled. "Am I in trouble?" he whispered, his voice tiny against the backdrop of the unfolding drama. Traoré looked down at the boy, his stern expression softening into a warmth that seemed to embrace the child. It was a look so full of compassion that even the toughest guards nearby found themselves blinking back unexpected emotion. "No, my son," Traoré said, his voice gentle. "You're not in trouble. You just saved a life. You are a hero." Soleimane blinked, his large eyes slowly filling with tears. But these were not tears of fear. They were the tears of a child who, after a lifetime of being invisible, of being unheard, had finally been seen, truly seen. And in that moment of recognition, everything was about to change. After the contaminated plate was secured as evidence and the cook was led away, President Traoré remained seated on the bench, holding Soleimane close. The boy's hands were cold, his small body alarmingly thin, like paper stretched over a delicate frame. His ribs were visible through the threadbare fabric of his shirt. "Why were you sleeping near the kitchen, Soleimane?" Traoré asked softly. The boy hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he replied, "Because sometimes they throw away leftover food at night. I wait until they close. Then I eat what I can find in the trash." The silence that followed was heavy, profound. Every person within earshot heard his words, and every heart felt their crushing weight. "I have no family," Soleimane continued, his voice cracking but devoid of self-pity. "My mama died a long time ago. My papa, he went to Ghana to find work and never came back. I sleep anywhere I can, under stalls, in doorways." President Traoré felt a pang in his own chest, a familiar ache from a past he rarely revisited. Without a word, he gently removed his own jacket, a simple but well-made garment, and wrapped it around Soleimane's shivering shoulders. Then, he turned to his security team, his voice leaving no room for debate. He doesn't leave my side. But, sir, one of the guards began, his concern for the president's safety evident, this area isn't secure for you, especially now. Traoré cut him off, his gaze firm. I said, he doesn't leave my side. A ripple of murmurs went through the watching crowd, quickly followed by a spontaneous burst of applause. Some people covered their mouths, tears welling in their eyes. No one had expected the president to stay after the immediate crisis. No one had expected him to show such deep, personal care for a homeless child, but he did. And in that humble street kitchen, something far bigger than politics, something rooted in basic human decency, had just begun. Soleimane's tiny legs could barely keep up with the president's purposeful stride, so Traoré, without a second thought, lifted the boy into his arms. He carried him through the stunned crowd, past the whispers and the awestruck faces, towards the waiting official vehicles. He placed Soleimane gently inside his own car, onto seats of soft leather, into an atmosphere of cool, conditioned air. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Soleimane didn't feel the oppressive heat and grime of the streets. He looked around, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and wonder. Am I going to jail? He asked, his voice small. Traoré smiled softly, a genuine reassuring smile. No, son, you're not going to jail. You're going to be safe. They drove in a comfortable silence, broken only by the loud growl of Soleimane's empty stomach. Embarrassed, the boy looked down, his cheeks flushing. Traoré, noticing his discomfort, reached for a bag beside him. From it, he produced fresh bread, a ripe banana, and a bottle of cold water. He handed them to Soleimane without a word, his actions speaking volumes. The boy's hands shook as he took the offering. Tears welled in his eyes again, but this time he blinked them back fiercely. I didn't mean to cause so much trouble, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. You saved my life, Soleimane, Traoré said, his voice firm but kind. That's not trouble. That's courage. Extraordinary courage. At the presidential residence, a grand but surprisingly welcoming place, a small room was quickly prepared. A comfortable bed was made with fresh linens, and new clothes were laid out. It was simple, yet it radiated a warmth and security Soleimane had only dreamed of. He stood at the doorway, hesitant, almost afraid to enter, as if expecting this dream to shatter. Traoré knelt beside him again. When was the last time you slept in a real bed, Soleimane? He asked gently. The boy looked up, a slow, shy smile spreading across his face, illuminating his dusty features. I don't remember, sir. And for the first time since his desperate shout in the market, he truly smiled, a smile of nascent hope. Later that night, long after Soleimane had drifted off to sleep, exhausted but safe, clutching the soft blanket tightly, President Traoré sat quietly by his bedside. Sleep eluded the president. An uncharacteristic disquiet settled in his heart. He found himself remembering, with vivid intensity, his own childhood. He too had known the gnawing emptiness of hunger, the cold fear of an uncertain tomorrow. These were memories he seldom shared, ghosts of a past he had fought hard to overcome. But tonight, stirred by Soleimane's plight, they returned, not as sources of pain, but as a powerful call to action. The next morning, as the golden light of dawn began to paint the city of Ouagadougou, an old woman arrived at the imposing gates of the presidential residence. Her clothes were simple, worn but clean, her eyes tired but filled with a desperate hope. She clutched a faded plastic bag containing a few old photographs and a small, hand-sewn child's shirt. I saw him on the news, she explained to the initially skeptical guards, her voice trembling. The little boy? The one who was with the president? I know. That's my grandson Soleimane. The guards remained unsure until she carefully pulled out the photographs. One of them showed a much younger Soleimane, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, standing proudly beside her, a wide, gap-toothed grin lighting up his face. I lost him when my daughter, his mother, passed away, she whispered, tears tracing paths down her weathered cheeks. We got separated during the riots 3 years ago. I've searched everywhere since. Every market, every shelter, every street corner. Inside the residence, Soleimane had just woken up. He was being shown around a small sunlit courtyard when a television screen, tuned to a morning news recap, caught his eye. It showed footage of the old woman at the gates, pleading her case. He gasped, his small body freezing mid-step. "Grandma?" He breathed, the word a mixture of disbelief and dawning joy. Outside, even the stoic guards were finding it hard to maintain their composure as they listened to the old woman's story. Traoré, informed of the development, quickly had Soleimane brought to him. He showed the boy the image on a security feed. Soleimane stared, his lips trembling. That's my grandma Amina," he exclaimed, his voice thick with emotion. Traoré turned to him gently. "Are you absolutely sure, Soleimane?" The boy nodded vigorously, tears now flowing freely. Yes. She used to sing me a song every night. She called me her little lion because she said I was brave even when I was small." Without wasting another second, President Traoré gave the order. "Bring her in." The reunion was a torrent of emotion. When Grandma Amina entered the room and saw Soleimane, she let out a choked cry and dropped her bag, its contents scattering unnoticed on the polished floor. "Soleimane!" she wept, rushing forward. The boy ran to her, his tiny feet echoing in the grand room, and they clung to each other, sobbing with a depth of emotion that made even the president and his aides turn away, offering them a moment of private, sacred grief and joy. "I thought I'd lost you forever, my little lion," she whispered, stroking his hair. President Traoré watched from the doorway, a quiet, almost invisible observer. For him, this reunion, this mending of a broken family, this restoration of a child's stolen security, was worth more than any political victory, any international treaty, any Medal of Honor. Later that evening, alone in his spacious office, Traoré found himself holding one of the photographs Grandma Amina had given him, Soleimane as a baby, nestled securely in her arms. A profound thought began to take root in his mind. If this one brave boy, whose shout had saved his life, had been left to wander the streets, lost and forgotten, how many more Soleimanes were out there? How many other little lions were struggling for survival, their potential unseen, their voices unheard? And just like that, an idea, born from compassion and fueled by a sense of urgent responsibility, began to grow. It was an idea that had the power to change not just one boy's life, but the lives of thousands. That night, President Traoré didn't summon his ministers or military generals for a formal state meeting. Instead, he made a series of quiet phone calls. He reached out to a small, carefully selected group of people: social workers, teachers, community volunteers, the unsung heroes who worked tirelessly in the shadows, saving lives with quiet dedication, far from the glare of cameras and the clamor of politics. By midnight, they were seated around a simple table with him in a modest meeting room at the palace. He spoke to them not as their president, but as a fellow citizen, his voice filled with a quiet passion. "I met a boy today," he began, his gaze sweeping over their attentive faces. "His name is Soleimane. He saved my life. He sleeps on the streets, he has eaten from garbage bins, but he is one of the bravest, brightest souls I have ever encountered." The group listened, stunned into silence by the rawness of his account. "I want every child like him off the streets," Traoré declared, his voice resonating with conviction. "Not next year, not next month. We start this week, now." A woman, a veteran social worker with kind eyes, raised her hand timidly. "Sir," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "with all due respect, there are thousands of them, maybe tens of thousands in Ouagadougou alone. The scale." "Then we start with 10, Traoré replied without hesitation. He stood up, his presence filling the room. "If we wait for the perfect plan, for unlimited resources, for the ideal moment, nothing will ever change. But if we start now, with what we have, fueled by love and determination, we can save lives. We will save lives." He reached into his personal desk drawer and pulled out a checkbook. He wrote a substantial check from his own funds and placed it on the table. "Use this," he said. "Feed them, clothe them, give them shelter. More importantly, show them they are valued. Hug them. We will find more money. We will build the infrastructure. But right now, tonight, we need to find more Soleimanes." And just like that, a mission was born. Not from a bureaucratic directive, but from the heart of a leader who had never forgotten where he came from, who understood the sting of neglect and the warmth of unexpected kindness. Before the sun even thought about rising over Ouagadougou, teams of volunteers, guided by the social workers, quietly fanned out through the city's sleeping streets. There were no sirens, no flashing lights, no media presence. Just unmarked vans, dedicated volunteers, warm blankets, and voices filled with genuine kindness. One team found 3 small children huddled together behind a market stall, using torn sacks as their only protection against the pre-dawn chill. Another discovered a girl, no older than 7, fast asleep near a fetid drainage pipe, her small hand clutching an empty plastic cup. When they gently woke her and asked her name, she whispered, "Kadi." By noon the next day, 10 children, including Kadi and the 3 from the market stall, had been brought to a hastily cleaned and reopened community care center. And waiting to greet them, with a bright smile and an armful of fresh clothes, was Solomane. He had a new self-appointed job, to welcome each child with a warm hug and the simple, powerful words, "You're safe now." President Traoré visited the center again that afternoon, this time without any guards, blending in seamlessly. He sat on the floor with the children, listening to their hesitant stories, sharing food, and telling them his own stories, tales of hope, resilience, and the courage found in unexpected places. But as he watched them laugh and play, a quiet, unsettling question began to stir deep within him. What if the poison plate hadn't been specifically intended for him? What if it was a callous act targeting anyone vulnerable, anyone who couldn't fight back, anyone who ate from that kitchen? As his eyes scanned the innocent faces around him, one thing became crystal clear. This was no longer just about saving one child who had saved him. This was about giving every forgotten child a voice, a future, and he was ready to fight for that, with every fiber of his being. Late that night, Solomane found he couldn't sleep. The events of the past few days replayed in his mind: the market, the fear, the president's kindness, his grandmother's return. He sat alone in his new room, hugging his knees under the warm blanket. A soft knock came at his door. It was President Traoré himself, holding 2 cups of warm, sweet tea. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked gently, his expression understanding. Solomane shook his head. The president sat beside him on the edge of the mattress. "Why did you shout that day in the market, Solomane?" Traoré asked, his voice low. "How did you know, really know, that something was wrong with the food?" The boy stared into the depths of his teacup. "I saw the man," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "The one who argued with the cook earlier. He was wearing a black jacket. He came back when he thought no one was looking, and he poured something from a small, dark bottle onto the fish and into the sauce pot. He didn't know I was hiding behind the big trash bin." Traoré froze, the warmth of the teacup suddenly failing to reach him. "Did you see his face clearly, Solomane?" Solomane nodded slowly. "Yes, I think I've seen him before. Sometimes he would come and talk to the kitchen owner, the cook who was arrested. They always looked angry when they talked." A heavy silence fell between them. President Traoré didn't say a word for a long moment. He simply placed a firm, reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "Thank you, Solomane," he said, his voice filled with a gratitude that went beyond words. "Thank you for your bravery, then and now." But inside the president, a storm had begun to brew. If someone had deliberately tried to poison food at a public street kitchen, a place frequented by the city's most vulnerable, what else were they capable of? This was no random act of malice. This was targeted, calculated. The truth, he realized, needed to come out, and it needed to come out fast. The safety of his people, not just his own, depended on it. The very next morning, President Traoré returned to the same street kitchen, but this time, he wasn't alone. Though he appeared to walk with only a couple of unassuming aides, hidden security agents moved discreetly through the nearby streets and alleys, a silent, watchful net. The kitchen itself appeared deceptively normal, almost too normal. The new cook, a nervous woman hired hastily, greeted him with a forced smile. "Welcome again, Mr. President. An honor, as always." But Traoré didn't sit down. He didn't order any food. "I'd like to see your kitchen storage," he said calmly, his gaze sweeping the small, cluttered space. The cook froze, her eyes darting nervously. I'm not sure it's tidy enough for a presidential inspection, sir." "We won't mind," Traoré replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. He stepped past her, into the dim, narrow kitchen. It smelled strongly of old oil, charcoal smoke, and something else. A faint, acrid undertone he couldn't quite place. Pots and pans clanged as a young teenager, clearly terrified, scrubbed dishes with frantic energy. Traoré's eyes scanned the area, noting the worn chopping blocks, the bags of rice and beans, and then something odd. A small, crudely built wooden cabinet in the darkest corner, secured with a shiny new padlock. "What's in there?" he asked, his voice casual yet pointed. "Oh, that?" the cook stammered, wiping her sweaty palms on her apron. "Just some old utensils, Mr. President. Nothing of importance." Traoré turned to one of his aides, a man built like a baobab tree. "Break it open." The room stiffened. The cook's eyes widened in panic. Before the aide could move, the cook shouted, "Wait! Please!" She rushed forward, intending to stop them. But in her haste, she stumbled, knocking over a stack of pans. The clatter exposed a cleverly hidden loose floorboard beneath the area where the stove usually sat. And nestled in the shallow compartment beneath it were 3 small glass vials. 2 were full of a clear liquid. 1 was half empty. Each bore a stark typewritten label, "Cyanide, extremely toxic." President Traoré's jaw clenched, a muscle pulsing in his cheek. A slow, heavy silence fell over the small kitchen, broken only by the distant sounds of the market waking up. Soleimane hadn't been imagining things. Someone had systematically, deliberately tried to poison him, and very likely others. This was no impulsive act of a disgruntled cook. This was an assassination attempt, cold and calculated, and it had been thwarted by the vigilance of a child. Back at the presidential palace, the National Laboratory swiftly confirmed their worst fears. The substance found in the vials wasn't just dangerous. It was a highly concentrated, fast-acting poison, lethal enough to kill multiple people with even minimal contact or ingestion, and notoriously difficult to trace after the fact. As President Traoré stared at the stark, chilling report in his hand, his heart felt heavy, not with fear for himself, but with a profound sense of betrayal and anger. Who would target a humble street kitchen, a place that served the poorest of the poor? What kind of monster would stoop so low? His most trusted security advisor, a man named Commander Diallo, entered the room, his face etched with concern. "Mr. President," Diallo began, "we've started tracing the ownership and suppliers of that kitchen. The business license, it's registered to a man named Karim Sonogo." Traoré raised an eyebrow. "That name sounds familiar." Diallo nodded grimly. "It should, sir. Karim Sonogo is a prominent, some would say notorious businessman. He runs several lucrative food supply contracts across Ouagadougou, some of them even for government canteens, though we're reviewing those immediately. More disturbingly, he's known to have made significant, albeit discreet, donations to several political factions that have been vocally opposed to your recent reform programs, particularly those aimed at greater transparency and aiding the urban poor." It clicked. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. This wasn't just about assassinating a president. This was about derailing progress, about crippling hope, about sending a brutal message to the very people who were beginning to believe that change was possible, that their lives could improve. It was an attack on the soul of the nation. "I want him found, Commander," Traoré said, his voice firm, an icy calm settling over his earlier anger. "And I want it done quietly, but quickly. We cannot allow this to escalate into public panic or political chaos." Diallo hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Sir, if news of Sonogo's involvement leaks before we have him and the full extent of his network, it could indeed cause widespread unrest, perhaps even violence. He has connections." Traoré walked to the window, looking out at the city below, at the distant sounds of children playing in the newly established shelter's yard, Soleimane's laughter among them, a sound that now represented everything he was fighting for. "That's precisely why we won't speak loudly with words of accusation yet," he replied, turning back to face Diallo, his eyes blazing with a cold fire. "We'll speak through swift, decisive justice." Behind his calm demeanor, a storm of righteous determination was rising. Karim Sonogo and his shadowy allies were about to learn a harsh lesson. They had gravely underestimated not only the resilience of a nation, but also the courage of a small, forgotten child, and the resolve of a leader who refused to let hope be poisoned. That same night, Traoré's specially selected team moved with the silence and precision of ghosts. A convoy of unmarked vehicles, their lights dimmed, glided through the darkened streets and stopped near an opulent, high-walled villa on the affluent outskirts of Ouagadougou. It belonged to Karim Sonogo. He was asleep in his lavish bedroom, oblivious to the net closing around him, when the agents bypassing his private security with ease entered his home. They found more than they had dared to hope for. Incriminating documents, detailed kitchen supply records with suspicious annotations, encrypted phone logs, and, most chillingly, a series of surveillance photographs of President Traoré, some marked with a red X over his image, clearly targeted. A detailed map of the city highlighted several street kitchens, some circled in red. The one Soleimane had saved him from was labeled Test Location, Final Week. The betrayal was deeper and more organized than they had initially feared. Karim Sonogo was dragged from his bed, disheveled and sputtering with indignation. "You have no proof," he shouted, his voice raspy with sleep and fury. "This is a political witch hunt. You can't do this." But his bluster died in his throat when he was brought outside and saw who was waiting for him in the cool night air, standing beside one of the unmarked cars. President Traoré, calm, silent, his eyes like chips of obsidian reflecting the dim moonlight, filled with a controlled, righteous fire. "You risked countless innocent lives," Traoré said, his voice low and cold, cutting through Sonogo's protests. "The lives of children, of the elderly, of the poorest among us. For what? For power? For greed?" Sonogo, momentarily stunned by the president's unexpected presence, sneered, a flicker of his usual arrogance returning. "For order!" he spat. "You and your reckless reforms are turning the poor against the rich, disrupting the way things have always been. You are the danger here, Traoré, not me." Traoré stepped closer, until he was inches from the handcuffed businessman. "No, Sonogo," he replied, his voice a dangerous whisper. "I'm giving the poor something you and your kind never did, something you fear, hope, and dignity." Karim Sonogo was swiftly and quietly taken away into the night, his empire of corruption and cruelty beginning to crumble. But the storm, President Traoré knew, was far from over. Soleimane's incredible act of bravery had done more than save one life. It had ripped the veil from a network of malice and greed that threatened the very fabric of their society. Now, Traoré had an even bigger, more critical mission: to protect not just himself, but every forgotten child, every vulnerable citizen, from those who would prey on them. The nation was about to witness something truly powerful, a testament to the strength that comes from unity and justice. The following morning, President Ibrahim Traoré made a decision that sent ripples of astonishment and no small amount of concern through his immediate staff. "I want to eat with the street children today," he announced, his tone calm but resolute. "At the shelter. No speeches, no cameras, just a shared meal." His advisors exchanged anxious glances. "Sir, after what happened, with Sonogo still at large and his network potentially active, is that wise?" one ventured. "Yes." Traoré nodded, his gaze unwavering. "It is precisely because of what happened. They need to see that fear will not dictate our actions, and that they are seen, valued, and protected." A few hours later, in a clean, sun-drenched open yard behind the hastily repurposed community center that now served as a bustling shelter, simple plastic tables and chairs were arranged. Dozens of children, their faces scrubbed clean, dressed in donated clothes, stared in wide-eyed disbelief as the president of their country walked among them, greeting each one with a warm smile and a gentle word. But what stunned them, and the handful of shelter workers present, into an almost reverent silence was this. President Traoré chose a seat next to Soleimane, and when the food arrived, simple, nourishing plates of rice and stew, identical for everyone, Traoré didn't touch his plate first. He looked at the boy whose life had become so unexpectedly intertwined with his own and said softly, "Will you eat with me, Soleimane?" Soleimane, his initial shyness giving way to a radiant smile, nodded eagerly. Together, the president and the former street child took the first bite. Tears welled in the eyes of the shelter workers, witnessing the profound simplicity of the moment. One whispered to another, "We've never seen anything like this. Never." Later, a little girl, bolder than the rest, tugged on Traoré's shirt. "Are you really the president?" she asked, her brow furrowed in childlike skepticism. He smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Yes, I am. But today, I'm mostly just your friend." That day, no one in that yard saw a powerful political leader or a distant head of state. They saw a man, sitting with the forgotten, eating from the same humble plate, treating them not as subjects or charity cases, but as family. And that image, that feeling, was more powerful and more resonant than any carefully crafted speech or political rally. After the meal, as the other children engaged in supervised play, Soleimane and President Traoré sat together under the shade of a large acacia tree. The boy stared up at the sky, a comfortable silence settling between them for a moment. Then he whispered, almost to himself, "Nobody ever cared enough to ask my full name before." Traoré looked at him, his expression gentle, inviting. "Tell me, Soleimane." "It's Soleimane Ouedraogo," the boy said, a quiet pride in his voice. "My mother, she used to call me her little sunrise. She said I brought light into her life. She died when I was 6. The words, spoken with a child's simple honesty, hit Traoré with the force of a physical blow. He listened quietly, patiently, letting the boy unburden his heart. "My father disappeared after that. People said he went to find work, but he never came back. I lived on the streets. Sometimes I really did eat from garbage. People, they looked right through me, like I wasn't even there." A pause, then Soleimane turned his gaze directly to the president, his eyes shining with an almost adult understanding. "But when you looked at me, that day in the market, you saw me." Traoré placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, his touch firm and reassuring. "I see someone strong, Soleimane Ouedraogo," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I see someone incredibly brave. I see someone who saved my life, and who has reminded an entire nation what truly matters." Soleimane's lips trembled. For the first time, perhaps in his entire life, he heard his full name spoken not with pity or indifference, but with love, respect, and admiration. I want to go to school one day," he said softly, voicing a dream he had barely dared to nurture. "I want to learn. I want to be someone who helps other people, like you helped me." Traoré nodded slowly, a profound sense of purpose solidifying within him. "You will, Soleimane. You will go to school, and you will do more than just learn. You'll live. You'll grow. You'll rise. I promise you that." And in that quiet, sun-dappled moment, a bond was forged. A bond deeper than politics, stronger than titles. A bond between a forgotten child who had found his voice and a leader who had rediscovered his nation's heart. Later that evening, President Traoré called an emergency press conference. There was no grand stage, no crimson carpet, no fanfare. Just a small, functional room with simple wooden chairs packed shoulder to shoulder with local and international journalists. At the front of the room, standing beside the presidential podium, was Soleimane Ouedraogo, cleaned up, wearing a new shirt, his small hand held firmly and reassuringly in Traoré's. The president began, his voice soft, but carrying an undeniable weight. "This week," he said, his gaze sweeping the room, "I came very close to eating poisoned food. An attempt was made on my life, but what hurts me more, what shakes me to my core, is what I discovered behind that horrific moment." He gestured gently towards Soleimane. "This boy, Soleimane Ouedraogo, didn't just save my life. He opened my eyes. He reminded me, and he reminded all of us, that we still have far too many children sleeping on our streets, begging for scraps to survive, treated like shadows in their own land." Traoré looked around the room, his voice thick with emotion that resonated with every person present. "That," he declared, his voice ringing with conviction, "ends now." He then announced the immediate creation of a new national shelter, healthcare, and education program, fully funded by the state with supplementary support from a new presidential foundation. "For every child like Soleimane Ouedraogo," he proclaimed, "there will be a safe place to sleep, a warm meal, a doctor when they are sick, a school to attend, and, most importantly, someone who believes in them." Gasps rippled through the room, quickly followed by a spontaneous, thunderous ovation. Seasoned journalists, usually cynical and detached, found themselves wiping tears from their eyes. Soleimane, overwhelmed but beaming, smiled shyly and then, remembering his manners, whispered, "Merci, Monsieur le Président." "Thank you, Mr. President." Traoré knelt beside him, his eyes shining. "Non, Soleimane," he replied, his voice full of gratitude. "Merci à toi, mon fils." "Thank you to you, my son." And just like that, one boy's courageous shout and one leader's willingness to listen and act had begun to rewrite the fate of a nation's most vulnerable. The entire country, watching live broadcasts, felt the power and sincerity of every word. The news spread like wildfire across Burkina Faso and beyond. Radios buzzed, phones rang incessantly, and television screens lit up with the image of Soleimane and President Traoré standing side by side, symbols of a new beginning. In markets, vendors paused their trade. In villages, elders gathered the children, their voices filled with emotion as they recounted the story. "This," they said, "is the kind of leader we have prayed for, one who sees the smallest among us." In schools, children began to draw pictures of a brave little boy and a kind president holding hands. Even hardened soldiers, men who had seen conflict and hardship, reportedly wept as they watched the replay of the press conference. A respected army commander was heard to whisper, "He's not just leading a country, he's healing its soul." But something even more beautiful, more profound, began to happen. Inspired by Soleimane's courage and their president's compassionate leadership, ordinary people started to act. Donations of clothes, food, books, and shoes poured into newly designated collection centers. Restaurant owners came forward, pledging to offer safe, regular meals to street children. Teachers, retired and active, volunteered their time to tutor. Families, who themselves had little, opened their homes to offer a warm meal or a kind word to children who had long been invisible. All because a homeless boy had dared to shout, "Don't eat that." All because a president had listened, not just with his ears, but with his heart and his conscience. This was no longer just a story about a leader or a child. It was rapidly becoming the story of a nation choosing kindness, choosing hope, choosing to uplift itself from within. And it wasn't over yet. The most poignant moment was still to come. On the 7th morning, exactly 1 week after that fateful encounter at the street kitchen, President Traoré returned. But this time, the scene was dramatically different. Dozens of children, their faces bright, stood in clean new clothes, holding plates filled with wholesome food. Soleimane was among them, standing proudly at the front. In his small hand, he clutched a tiny, carefully chosen bouquet of vibrant wildflowers. As Traoré bent down, Soleimane stepped forward, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "These are for you, Mr. President," he said, his voice clear and strong. "You gave me back my name. You gave me back my grandma. You gave us all a tomorrow." Traoré hugged him tightly, a lump in his own throat. As the morning sun rose higher, casting its golden glow over the transformed scene, he gently took Soleimane's hand and lifted it into the air for all to see. "This," President Traoré declared, his voice ringing with hope and conviction, "this is Soleimane Ouédraogo, and this is the future of Burkina Faso." The crowd, a mixture of children, shelter workers, local residents, and even some of the journalists who had followed the story, erupted in joyous cheers and applause. Tears flowed freely, not of sorrow, but of profound, heartfelt hope. In that moment, hope was reborn, tangible and vibrant, in the hearts of thousands. And when President Traoré finally sat down to eat, this time safely surrounded by smiling, chattering children, the entire nation, watching through the eyes of the media, who respectfully kept their distance, felt the warmth and authenticity of that shared meal. Not because it was a perfect solution to all problems, but because it was real, a testament to the power of one boy's courage, one president's compassion, and one nation's awakening to the possibility of change. The journey was just beginning, but the path forward was illuminated by the bright, unwavering light of shared humanity.